Matthew Evans sat alone in his sleek silver Mercedes, the rhythmic hum of the engine doing little to mask his growing frustration. The scorching Kentucky sun bore down mercilessly, and despite the air conditioning, the heat pressed against him like a heavy weight. He tapped his fingers impatiently on the leather steering wheel, his gaze shifting between the cracked asphalt ahead and the lifeless signal bar on his phone screen. At 73, Matthew was no stranger to life's conveniences. Decades of success in finance had ensured that problems were nothing more than minor inconveniences, usually solved with a phone call, a check, or a well-placed demand. But today, stranded on an empty country road with a flat tire, he found himself in an unfamiliar predicament, one that money alone couldn't instantly fix. He had already attempted to call for roadside assistance, but his phone stubbornly displayed no signal. With a sharp sigh, he leaned back against the seat, shifting uncomfortably. It wasn't a disaster, just a delay. But patience had never been his virtue. How long had he been waiting? 20 minutes? 30? He glanced at his watch, his irritation rising. The road stretched before him, empty and silent, save for the distant chirping of crickets from the golden fields on either side. Then, movement caught his eye. A lone figure, a boy, was walking down the road. Matthew narrowed his gaze. The boy looked no older than 14, dressed in a faded black t-shirt and worn-out sneakers. His jeans were slightly too big, the cuffs dusted with dirt from the road. Yet despite his modest appearance, there was a quiet confidence in the way he moved. As the boy approached, he slowed, his sharp eyes scanning the stranded luxury car before meeting Matthew's gaze. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady, unhurried. Monsieur hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah. Damn thing just gave out on me. Tried calling for help, but there's no signal out here." The boy studied the deflated tire, then glanced at the open road behind him, as if considering something. Finally, with a small nod, he spoke. "I can help with that." Monsieur blinked. "You can." The boy nodded again, stepping forward without hesitation. "Yeah. My grandpa taught him how to change a tire last summer." Matthew had expected sympathy, maybe a suggestion to wait for another passing car. But here was this boy, a complete stranger, offering help as if it were the most natural thing in the world. With a reluctant nod, Matthew gestured toward the trunk. "The spare's in there." The boy moved with practiced ease, pulling out the tools and kneeling beside the tire. Matthew watched in silence as the boy inspected the damage and set to work. For the first time in years, Matthew Evans, business mogul, self-made millionaire, stood by helplessly as someone else took charge. Matthew studied the boy as he worked, his movements sure and precise. Ilya. That was his name. Matthew would learn it later, but at that moment, he simply watched, mesmerized by the quiet focus of this boy who couldn't have been older than 13 or 14. His black t-shirt was worn from too many washes, his sneakers scuffed from miles of walking. Yet, there was a confidence in him, an ease that made him seem older than his years. Elijah had approached without fear, without hesitation. There had been no uncertainty in his steps, no doubt in his voice. He had seen the problem and stepped forward to solve it, just like that. "You do this often?" Matthew asked as Elijah tightened the bolts with practiced efficiency. Ilya shrugged. "Sometimes. My grandpa always says it's good to know how to fix things yourself." Matthew felt something stir in his chest. How long had it been since he had fixed anything with his own hands? Since he had relied on skill rather than wealth to solve a problem? Before he could dwell on the thought, Elijah wiped his hands on his jeans and took a step back. "All done," he said simply, offering a small satisfied smile. Monsieur blinked. "That fast?" Elijah nodded. "Tires aren't so bad. Just gotta know what you're doing." Matthew reached into his wallet and pulled out a few crisp bills, holding them out. "Here, take this," he said. "I really appreciate the help." To his shock, Elijah took a step back, shaking his head. "No, sir. You don't need anything." Matthew frowned. "Kid, you just saved me a hell of a lot of trouble. It's just a thank you." But Elijah only tucked his hands into his pockets and smiled. "You don't have to pay someone for doing the right thing." Monsieur stot Tiere, frozen. People didn't turn down money. Not in his world. For a long moment, he just stared at the boy, still holding the cash in his hand. Elijah gave him one final nod before turning and walking away, his silhouette growing smaller against the sunlit road. Matthew slowly lowered his hand, slipping the money back into his wallet. For years, his life had been built on transactions, on deals, on exchanges, on making sure that every action had a payoff. But today, he had been helped not because of his wealth, not because of his power, but because of something far rarer: kindness. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to make of it. Matthew Evans sat alone in his grand estate that evening, surrounded by the quiet luxury of his world. The chandelier above cast a warm glow across the polished marble floors, and the scent of his untouched dinner, steak and asparagus, prepared to perfection, filled the air. Yet, despite the comfort, his mind was elsewhere. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, staring at nothing in particular. Ilya. The boy's name lingered in his thoughts, unshakable. Matthew had met thousands of people in his lifetime, business partners, investors, competitors, but there had always been an exchange, a deal, an expectation. No one had ever helped him simply because it was the right thing to do. Elijah had nothing, yet he carried himself like someone who had everything that truly mattered. Matthew glanced at the framed photos lining his study, pictures of himself shaking hands with powerful men, standing beside luxury cars, smiling at grand openings of businesses. They were symbols of his achievements, proof of his success. And yet, they felt hollow compared to the simple, unguarded kindness of a boy with dust on his hands and a quiet dignity in his heart. For the first time in years, Matthew Evans, who had spent a lifetime believing wealth was the measure of a man, felt small. He set down his glass, exhaling sharply. He needed to find that boy. The next morning, Matthew climbed into his car and retraced his steps back to that deserted road. It was foolish, perhaps. What did he expect to find? A boy walking the same path, waiting for another stranger to help? Still, something deep inside him pushed him forward. He stopped at the first gas station he passed, approaching the man behind the counter. "Hey, I'm looking for a kid, black boy, maybe 14, helped me out yesterday with a flat tire." The man shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone like that." Matthew moved to the next stop, a small diner on the side of the road. He stepped inside, the scent of coffee and bacon greeting him as he approached an older waitress wiping down a table. "Excuse me," he said, clearing his throat. "I'm looking for a boy named Elijah. Young kid, helped me fix my car yesterday." She frowned, thinking for a moment. Then, recognition flickered across her face. "You mean Ilya? Helps folks around here all the time. Sweet kid." She dried her hands on her apron before adding, "Lives with his mama in Harlan." Harlan. Matthew repeated the name in his head. He knew of it, a small town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, far from the world of wealth and privilege he lived in. He nodded his thanks, turned on his heel, and walked briskly back to his car. Without a second thought, he put the key in the ignition and set off toward Harlan, chasing a feeling he still didn't fully understand. The drive to Harlan was long, winding through rolling hills and quiet stretches of farmland. Matthew barely noticed the scenery. His mind was too preoccupied with the thought of Elijah. As he pulled into the small town, he immediately noticed how different it was from the world he knew. The houses were modest, some showing the wear of time, but they were cared for. Small shops lined the main street, their signs faded but inviting. Life here moved slower, more deliberately. After asking a few locals for directions, he finally arrived at a narrow dirt road leading to a small house on the outskirts of town. It was old, the paint peeling in places, and the wooden porch sagged slightly under its own weight. But it was tidy, flowers planted along the steps, a laundry line swaying gently in the breeze. Matthew stepped out of his car, smoothing his jacket as he approached the front door. He hesitated for a brief moment before knocking. A woman answered, a woman in her early 40s, her face lined with exhaustion but softened by warmth. She had Elijah's eyes. She looked at Matthew with curiosity. "Can I help you, sir?" He cleared his throat. "Good morning. My name is Matthew Evans. I believe I met your son yesterday. He helped me with a flat tire." Her face relaxed into a gentle smile. "That sounds like my Elijah. He's always helping folks." Matthew found himself smiling in return. He wouldn't take anything from me for it. I just wanted to thank him properly. She nodded knowingly and gestured toward the backyard. "He's out back fixing the fence. You're welcome to wait." Matthew followed her inside. Stepping into Elijah's home was like stepping into a world completely different from his own. The furniture was old but well kept. The floors creaked slightly with every step. The walls were lined with family photos, smiling faces, moments frozen in time. On one side of the living room, hand-drawn pictures hung proudly, clearly the work of a much younger Elijah. It was nothing like Matthew's mansion with its pristine surfaces and expensive artwork. But somehow, this place felt warmer. Through the kitchen window, he spotted Elijah in the backyard, crouched near a wooden fence, carefully hammering a loose plank into place. The boy looked up, his brows furrowing for a split second before recognition dawned on his face. "Mr." Elijah called, wiping his hands on his jeans as he stood. Matthew stepped outside, offering a small nod. "Hey, kid." Elijah approached, curiosity written all over his face. "What are you doing here?" Matthew chuckled. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, his expression easy and genuine. "It wasn't a big deal." Matthew smiled, shaking his head. "Maybe not to you. But it was to me." Elijah's mother called from the doorway. "Elia, come wash up. Lunch is ready." Then, she turned to Matthew. "Would you care to join us? It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome." Matthew hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to invitations like this, spontaneous, genuine, without any agenda. But something about the warmth in her voice made it impossible to refuse. "I'd like that," he said. Inside, the kitchen smelled of fresh bread and roasted vegetables. The table was small, surrounded by mismatched chairs, but it was set with care. Elijah washed his hands at the sink before taking a seat, his smile never fading. As they ate, Matthew found himself drawn into their conversation. Stories about the community, about Elijah's school, his friends, his dreams. "I want to be an engineer one day," Elijah shared between bites. "I like figuring out how things work, how to fix them." Matthew listened intently, nodding. "You'd be good at it." For all his wealth and success, he realized something unsettling. His own home, with all its luxury, had never felt this full, this alive. This wasn't just a house. This was a home. As the meal wound down, Matthew placed his fork down and glanced at Elijah and his mother. The warmth in their home was undeniable, but so was the struggle they had endured. The worn furniture, the patched-up walls, the way Elijah's mother spoke about making do with what they had, it all painted a picture of resilience, but also of quiet hardship. Taking a breath, he spoke. "I'd like to help." Elijah's mother looked at him curiously. "Help with what, Mr. Evans?" Matthew gestured around the room. "With this. With the house. With anything you need." She shook her head, offering a small but firm smile. "That's kind of you, but we're fine. We've managed this long." Elijah nodded in agreement. "Yeah, mister. We don't need anything." Matthew leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I know you don't need it. But that's not the point. It's not about necessity. It's about what's right." They exchanged a glance, uncertainty flickering between them. "Elijah helped me without expecting anything in return," Matthew continued. "That kind of kindness deserves to be recognized. Not as charity, but as gratitude." Elijah's mother studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right, Mr. Evans. If this is really something you want to do, we won't stop you." Matthew smiled. "Good. Because I've got a plan." The next morning, Matthew was on the phone before the sun had even fully risen. He called in favors from old business partners, reached out to contractors he trusted, and connected with suppliers who could deliver materials quickly. The house wasn't falling apart, but it needed work that Elijah's family shouldn't have to worry about. By noon, everything was set in motion. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, the first trucks arrived. Elijah stood on the porch, wide-eyed as workers unloaded supplies. "What's all this?" he asked. Matthew, standing beside him, smirked. "This kid is the start of something good." Over the next few weeks, the house underwent a complete transformation. The sagging porch was torn down and rebuilt with strong, sturdy wood. The leaky roof was patched up and reinforced. The kitchen received modern appliances, making life a little easier for Elijah's mother. The backyard swing set, rusted and broken, was replaced with a brand new one. Elijah watched the progress with fascination. He was no longer just an observer, he wanted to understand the process. "Can I help?" he asked one of the workers one afternoon. The man, a gruff-looking contractor named Joe, chuckled.
"You serious, kid?"
Elijah nodded eagerly.
"Yeah, I want to learn."
Joe shrugged.
"I'll richten."
"Grab that tape measure and follow me." From that day forward, Elijah was everywhere, learning how to measure wood, watching how things were built, asking endless questions about tools and materials. Matthew watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time, Elijah wasn't just fixing things out of necessity. He was discovering a passion. And for Matthew, seeing that was more rewarding than any business deal he had ever made. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the renovation was about more than just repairing a house. It was building something far greater. Elijah had always been resourceful, always fixing what he could, but now with real craftsmen around him, he was learning in a way he never had before. Matthew noticed it right away, the way the boy's eyes lit up when he watched the workers measure, cut, and assemble pieces with precision. The way his hands, once hesitant, grew more confident as he held a wrench, a saw, or a hammer. One afternoon, Matthew pulled aside Joe, the lead contractor. "What do you think?" he asked, nodding toward Elijah, who was helping another worker hold a plank steady. Joe chuckled. "Kid's got a good head on his shoulders. Picks up fast. He's got the makings of a real builder." That was all Matthew needed to hear. The next day, he formally introduced Elijah to the team. "All right, kid," he said with a smirk. "You're officially on the crew. Time to learn the real stuff." Elijah grinned from ear to ear. "Seriously?" Matthew nodded. "But no slacking. You work, you learn." From that day on, Elijah was in the thick of it, learning how to read blueprints, how to calculate measurements, how to work with wood and steel. He wasn't just fixing a house anymore. He was building a future. At first, Matthew had thought he was simply giving back, paying a debt of gratitude. But as he returned to Harlan, again and again, he realized it was more than that. For decades, he had measured his worth in numbers, bank accounts, stock values, assets. But here in this little town, standing among people who worked hard, loved deeply, and helped each other without expecting anything in return, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. He no longer came just to oversee the work. He stayed for the conversations, the laughter, the simple joy of sharing a meal on the front porch. He found himself drawn to the warmth of Elijah's home, to the easy way his mother smiled despite life's hardships, to the boy who had unknowingly given him a second chance at understanding what truly mattered. One evening, as the final touches on the house were being completed, Matthew sat with Elijah and his mother on the new porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Elijah leaned back, watching the colors shift. "One day," he said thoughtfully, "I want to do something like this. Help people like you helped us." Matthew smiled, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already have, Elijah. You started all of this, with one act of kindness." The boy looked up at him, eyes shining with quiet pride. And in that moment, Matthew knew. This was the most meaningful investment he had ever made. Not in a house. Not in a business. But in a boy who would go on to change the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, soaking in the warmth, not just of the evening, but of something far deeper. A connection. A purpose. A new beginning. Conclusion.
Kindness needs no reward. A single act of genuine kindness can change our life.
Elijah didn't expect anything in return, yet his small gesture set off a chain of events that transformed both his and Matthew's futures. Love matters more than wealth. A home filled with warmth, love, and connection is far richer than a mansion filled with loneliness. Matthew learned that true wealth is measured by the people we cherish, not the money we accumulate. Small actions, big impact, a simple moment, one boy helping a stranger, became the catalyst for something much greater. Sometimes, the smallest choices lead to the biggest changes. Inspiring a cycle of goodness, kindness is contagious. By helping others, we encourage them to do the same, creating ripples of compassion that can reach far beyond what we ever imagined. One good deed can spark a lifetime of change. Never underestimate the power of kindness. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.